Frank Matthews set a plate of pancakes on the table and gave a small nod to the older woman. Fumbling for her wallet, "No rush, Mrs. Carter. You can pay when you're ready," he said, glancing toward the counter where the coffee was burning. Across the cafe, a group of teens huddled at a booth. One boy smirked, raised his phone, and whispered, "Get this nightmare fuel." The flash snapped. Laughter. Frank kept wiping the counter, shoulders tight. Near the window, Tom Harris paused mid-bite, eyes fixed on the faded tattoo, just visible under Frank's sleeve, a Special Forces insignia. "Ryan," Tom said sharply, turning to his son, "put the phone down right now." The room went quiet. Frank Matthews hadn't always been the quiet man pouring coffee and stacking plates at Maplewood Café. Decades earlier, he had been a young combat medic with the U.S. Army, serving in the humid, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam. Fresh out of training, Frank had been known as Doc to his unit, the guy who could patch you up when everything around you was falling apart. In 1971, on a sweltering day near the Cambodian border, Frank's life changed forever. His unit was ambushed, and a helicopter sent to evacuate the wounded was shot down just a few hundred yards away. Without waiting for orders, Frank sprinted toward the burning wreckage. Dodging gunfire and shrapnel, he pulled one man out, then went back for another and another. On his third trip, the helicopter exploded, sending a wave of heat and flame over his body. Somehow, he survived, dragging the final injured soldier clear before collapsing. Frank spent months in a military hospital, undergoing skin grafts and painful treatments for the burns that covered half his face, neck, and arms. When he was finally discharged, there was no hero's welcome waiting. The country was bitterly divided over the war. He returned home to protests, to people calling soldiers baby killers, to strangers turning away from his scars with a mix of fear and disgust. There were no parades, no thank you speeches, no medals handed to him in front of cheering crowds. Frank tried to fit back into civilian life, but the transition was brutal. The mirror reminded him every day of what he'd been through. People stared. Some even crossed the street to avoid walking past him. He avoided the local Veterans Hall, skipped the parades, and stayed away from the reunions. Memories of combat were hard enough. Trying to explain them to people who didn't understand made it worse. He met his wife, Ellen, in a small grocery store where she worked as a cashier. She saw past the scars, past the stares, past the wounded man, and into the heart of someone still trying to find his place in a world that no longer felt familiar. They were married quietly and made a simple life together in the small Missouri town of Maplewood. But after 30 years of marriage, Ellen passed away suddenly from cancer, leaving Frank alone. For a while, Frank drifted, unsure of what to do with his days. Eventually, he took a job at Maplewood Café, a local fixture, the kind of place where the coffee was always fresh and the conversation always light. The cafe became his refuge, a place where no one asked about the past, and no one demanded stories he wasn't ready to share. There he found a rhythm. Coffee poured, plates cleared, tables wiped, days passed. To most of the customers, Frank was just the quiet older man with the steady hands, always polite, always dependable, and that was exactly how he wanted it until the day everything changed. It was a typical Saturday morning at Maplewood Café. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, and the sound of forks against plates mixed with low conversation. Frank Matthews moved through the narrow aisles between tables, balancing a tray of pancakes and eggs, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. At the corner booth, a group of teenagers had taken over to tables, laughing a little too loudly for the small-town cafe. Brian Harris, 17 and always trying to impress his friends, sat with his phone in hand, eyeing Frank as he worked his way down the row of customers. "Dude, check this out," Brian whispered to the boy next to him. "Nightmare fuel, man." As Frank passed, Brian angled his phone just so, pretending to check a text, and with a quick tap, snapped a photo of Frank's profile. The scarred skin running along Frank's neck and jaw caught the morning light, and Brian bit back a snicker as he flashed the phone to his friends. They stifled their laughter, shoulders shaking. Frank heard it all. He didn't need to see the phone to know what had happened. Years of working in the cafe had sharpened his instincts. He kept his expression neutral, his shoulders squared, as he delivered an order to another table. His fingers, though, tightened just slightly round the coffee pot, the only outward sign of the sting he felt deep in his chest. Across the cafe, Tom Harris, Ryan's father, paused mid-bite, a retired Army officer with silver hair and a weathered face. Tom had been lost in conversation with another customer until the flash of the phone and the boys' muffled laughter caught his attention. He turned, eyes narrowing on his son and his friends, and that's when he saw it. As Frank reached across a table to pour coffee, the sleeve of his uniform shirt pulled back, revealing a faded tattoo just above his wrist, a Special Forces insignia, intertwined with an old unit code. Tom's heart skipped. He knew that tattoo. He had seen it on arms, helmets, and walls overseas during the long, bloody years in Vietnam. For a split second, the cafe disappeared, and Tom was back in the jungle, back among young men with steel in their eyes and terror in their hearts. He remembered the medics, the docs who ran headfirst into danger, pulling the wounded from firefights and minefields. He looked again at Frank, the quiet waiter, the man his son was mocking, and the memories rushed in, the jungle, the chaos, the voices shouting for help. Tom's jaw clenched. Without a word, he reached across the table and gently but firmly took Ryan's wrist, lowering the phone. Brian jerked his head up, surprised. "Dad, what?" Tom's voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. "Put it away." Brian frowned. "It's just a picture. Chill out." Tom kept his gaze on Frank. That man saved more lives than you can imagine. For the first time that morning, Brian fell silent. Something in his father's face told him this wasn't just about a waiter. This was about something much, much bigger. Tom Harris kept his eyes on Frank as the waiter moved through the cafe. The boys at the booth had gone quiet, sensing a shift in the air. Brian shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at his father, who still held his phone. "Dad, seriously," Brian mumbled, "it's just a joke." Tom shook his head slowly. "No, Brian, it's not just a joke." He set the phone on the table. Hands folded, gaze steady. "Do you know what that tattoo means? Do you know what he's been through?" Ryan shrugged, trying to brush it off. "He's just some old guy, Dad." Tom leaned forward, voice calm but edged with something that made Brian sit up straighter. "That old guy pulled men out of hell. Men like him carried bodies under fire, patched up soldiers so they could see another sunrise, stayed awake through nights you can't imagine." Brian fidgeted with his napkin, his friends now watching their interaction with wide eyes. Tom let out a long breath, his mind drifting to faces he hadn't thought of in years, faces young, eager, and terrified, men who depended on medics like Frank to get them through, medics who rarely got medals, parades, or even thanks. He looked down at the phone again, anger tightening his chest. "You know, I came home from Vietnam, and people spat at me in airports, called me a murderer. But at least I didn't carry the kind of scars he does." Brian's mouth opened, but Tom held up a hand. "Listen." Frank had just stepped back into the kitchen, the small bell on the door jingling behind him. Tom motioned to the cafe owner, Hank. "Sir, can I talk to your waiter for a moment?" Hank hesitated. Frank's on shift. Something wrong?" Tom shook his head. "No, I just need to say thank you." Hank disappeared into the back, returning a minute later with a regretful look. "He says no, sir. He's, private about things." Tom nodded slowly. "Tell him Tom Harris was here, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry. He'll know." As Hank carried the message away, Tom leaned back in his seat, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "Dad," Brian started softly. Tom rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "We've got a lot to talk about when we get home." That evening, Tom Harris sat at his old wooden desk at home, staring at the glow of his computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain at first. Brian sat on the couch nearby, unusually quiet, occasionally glancing at his phone, but not laughing like usual. Tom opened the Facebook group he hadn't visited in months, a private group for veterans of the Vietnam War. He drew a breath, then began typing. "Today, at a little cafe in Maplewood, I saw a hero clearing tables. His name is Frank Matthews, a combat medic from Vietnam. This man pulled soldiers from burning wreckage, saved lives under fire, and now he's waiting tables while teenagers mock his scars. What does it say about us when we fail to honor the people who gave us everything? He hit post and sat back, unsure if anyone would even read it. Within an hour, his phone buzzed once, then again, then almost non-stop. Comments flooded in. I remember Doc Matthews. He patched up my cousin. We need to do better. Tell that man he's not forgotten. By midnight, the post had been shared over 100 times across veteran networks. The next morning, it had reached thousands across several states. Veterans, active duty soldiers, military families all were commenting, sharing, and tagging friends. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, the teenagers who had taken the mocking photos had already posted them online with snide captions. But by Sunday afternoon, their feeds looked very different. The posts were flooded with comments, and not the kind they expected. That's a combat medic you're laughing at. Show some respect, kid. Take this down and apologize. By evening, Ryan sat on his bed, phone in hand, staring at the hundreds of comments piling onto his friend's post. His stomach twisted as he realized the ripple effect of what they had done. At Maplewood Café, Frank remained unaware of the storm brewing online. He worked his Sunday morning shift the same way he always did, head down, voice soft, plates balanced steadily in his hands. But something subtle had already started to shift. The regulars were watching him a little differently now. There was recognition in their eyes, a quiet sense of respect where before there had only been polite distance. Sunday morning arrived quietly, with the usual hum of forks on plates and the soft chatter of regulars at Maplewood Café. Frank Matthews tied on his apron, slipped through the back door, and began his shift like he had hundreds of times before. To him, it was just another day. But to the town, something had changed. By 7 a.m., a few unfamiliar faces sat scattered around the cafe. Men and women in military dress uniforms took seats at corner tables and booths, ordering nothing more than coffee or toast. Each one placed a small card on their table that read simply, "Thank you, Doc." Hank, the cafe owner, leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching as the uniforms kept coming, first a handful, then a dozen, then nearly 2 dozen by mid-morning. Maplewood Café had never been this busy on a Sunday morning. Frank stepped onto the floor, balancing a tray of coffee mugs. He stopped cold near the entrance, eyes scanning the room. Marines in crisp dress blues, Army veterans in their old unit jackets, Navy men with silver hair sitting with quiet posture. And every table, every single one, had the same card facing outward toward him. For a moment, Frank considered turning around. His fingers twitched slightly on the tray, his mind flashing back to moments when attention had only ever brought discomfort or pity. But then Hank was at his side, voice low. "Frank, they're here for you." Frank swallowed, squared his shoulders, and continued forward. As he approached the first table, a Marine gunnery sergeant stood and gave a sharp salute. "Doc Matthews," he said, voice steady. "Thank you for not leaving anyone behind." Frank froze, caught mid-step. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand, and the Marine took it in a firm grip. Around the cafe, conversations quieted. One by one, veterans stood to shake his hand, to nod, to say thanks in the simplest way they knew. By late morning, word had spread beyond the cafe walls. Cars lined the street outside, news crews gathered near the sidewalk, and locals pressed their faces to the cafe windows. Frank continued his work, clearing tables and refilling coffee. But now, everywhere he turned, eyes met his, not with discomfort, but with gratitude. By noon, the scene at Maplewood Café was unlike anything the small Missouri town had seen before. News vans were parked along Main Street, cameras angled toward the modest diner as curious locals gathered outside. Inside, Frank Matthews moved between tables, balancing trays and filling coffee cups, his routine unchanged except for the weight of dozens of watchful eyes. The veterans inside had transformed the cafe into something sacred that morning. Marines, Army vets, Navy officers, some young, some old, some in uniform, others in jeans and ball caps with unique patches, all waited patiently for their turn to greet Frank. Each handshake carried a story. Each nod held a memory dot. At one table, a woman in navy dress blues stood and approached Frank. She held a small, worn box in her hands. "My father," she began softly, "was one of the men you pulled from that helicopter. He passed last year, but he made me promise if I ever found you to give you this." She opened the box to reveal a purple heart. Frank stared at it, stunned. She pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers gently around it before stepping back, leaving him speechless. Near the back, Tom Harris entered with his two sons, Brian, face pale and eyes downcast, and James, a tall man with a limp, leaning heavily on a cane. As they approached, Frank turned, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me," James said with a small smile. "Third vehicle in the convoy." Frank's brow furrowed, then cleared. "Fractured femur, shrapnel, lower back. You kept trying to stand." James gave a quiet laugh. "Yeah, you kept knocking me back down on that stretcher." The two men embraced, a brief, firm grip that spoke volumes without words. Then James stepped aside, motioning to Brian. Brian shifted awkwardly, face flushed. "I am sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't know. I was just trying to be funny. It was stupid." Frank looked at him, then gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have a choice now," he said softly. "Choose better." By the afternoon, social media had turned the tide. The mocking photos were buried beneath images of Frank shaking hands, receiving medals, and quietly returning to his tables. The man who once tried to disappear into the background had, without asking for it, become the quiet center of his town's respect. The days following that Sunday marked a quiet transformation. At Maplewood Café, word of Frank Matthews had spread far beyond their small town. News reports aired across local channels. Veterans groups from neighboring counties called in to offer thanks, and people who once kept their distance now waited in line just to sit in Frank's section. But for Frank, the most meaningful change came not from the cameras or the visitors. It came from Brian Harris. 2 days after that unforgettable Sunday, Ryan walked into the cafe alone, no friends laughing at his side, no phone pulled out for photos. He stood by the counter, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, until Frank noticed him. Frank wiped his hands on a towel and came over, his expression calm. "Can I get you something, son?" Frank asked. Brian shook his head. "No, sir. I just wanted to say again, I'm sorry, not just for the photo, but for everything. I didn't know who you were. I didn't think about what you'd been through." Frank studied him quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Takes guts to come back in here." "That's a good start." Brian hesitated. "My dad and we've been talking a lot. He told me more about the war, about the guys like you." He looked down, fidgeting with his sleeve. "I want to do better. I was wondering, could I help out here, volunteer, maybe?" Frank's brow lifted in surprise. "That's up to Hank," he said, glancing toward the kitchen. "But I think it's a fine idea." That afternoon, something remarkable happened. Ryan and a few of his classmates started handing out flyers outside the cafe, not for an event or a school dance, but for a fundraiser they'd organized to support wounded veterans. The very boys who had mocked Frank were now determined to make amends, working to raise money and awareness for those who had come home carrying scars. Both seen and unseen. Inside, the cafe found a new rhythm. Veterans continued to stop by, but they honored Frank's preference for normalcy. No more cameras, no more fanfare. Customers who had once asked to switch servers now quietly requested Frank's section. For Frank, life hadn't gone back to what it was, but it had become something better. In the quiet clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, he found a rare kind of peace, not from hiding his past, but from finally being seen for all of who he was. A week after the Sunday that had changed everything, Frank Matthews found a letter waiting for him in his mailbox, official heavy paper, stamped with a government seal. Inside was a formal invitation from the Pentagon, a ceremony to honor battlefield medics with special mention of his name. The letter explained that a Medal of Honor nomination for Frank, long delayed by administrative mix-ups after the war, was being reactivated. They wanted him to attend, to stand on a stage in Washington, D.C. and be recognized for his heroism decades earlier. Frank sat at his kitchen table that night, the letter resting on the worn wood in front of him. His fingers traced the edges, but his eyes were far away. He thought back to the jungle, the smell of smoke, the chaos, the cries for help. He remembered Ellen, his late wife, who had always been his calm in the storm. He thought of the years spent quietly behind a diner counter, blending into the background. The next morning, Frank mentioned the letter to Hank while they were prepping the cafe for the breakfast rush. "You're going, right?" Hank asked, eyes wide. "Frank, that's a once-in-a-lifetime thing." Frank shook his head slightly. "I'm fine right here, Hank. I don't need medals or cameras. I've had enough of people looking at me like a headline." Hank frowned. "Frank, they want to honor you, I know," Frank said quietly. "But that's not why I did what I did." The cafe had changed in small but meaningful ways. Customers greeted Frank by name. The veterans who came in no longer treated him like a ghost or a symbol. They treated him like a man, a fellow soldier who wanted peace more than attention. And Brian and his friends, once noisy troublemakers, now showed up every Saturday to help with the cafe's new veteran fundraiser, collecting donations and running small first aid workshops. Frank folded the letter carefully and placed it in his locker at the cafe. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the honor. He just didn't need it to know who he was. For Frank Matthews, the greatest recognition wasn't found in medals or ceremonies, but in quiet moments, a handshake, a nod, a life lived with dignity in a town that finally saw the man behind the scars. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Frank Matthews found the card. He entered the cafe before sunrise, as usual, his boots echoing softly on the tile floor. The chairs were still flipped onto the tables, the air smelled faintly of fresh bread, and the world outside hadn't yet stirred awake. As Frank reached his usual spot by the break room, he noticed an envelope resting on his chair. He picked it up slowly, fingers rough from years of work. The handwriting was familiar, a little uneven, young. He opened it. "Your scars are medals we cannot wear for you." There was no name signed, but Frank recognized Brian's handwriting. Frank let out a slow breath and set the card on the table. Through the window into the dining room, he noticed something else that made him pause. A group of teenagers, Brian and his friends, were gathered at a booth, notebooks open, watching as an off-duty paramedic demonstrated how to wrap a tourniquet and check a pulse. Hank came up beside him, wiping his hands on a towel. "We're letting them use the space for first aid workshops. Seemed like the least we could do." Frank watched quietly as the teens leaned forward, asking questions, practicing on each other. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift deep inside, not pride, not attention, but a quiet sense of meaning. That afternoon, Frank returned to his usual routine. He poured coffee, cleared plates, and offered quiet greetings. But the regulars now smiled a little warmer, and when they left, they often patted him on the shoulder or left a handwritten note at the table. Frank understood now that some things, scars, medals, regrets, never fully disappear. But they could become something else, a reminder to others, a quiet example, a way to show what resilience looks like. As the cafe buzzed into the evening, Frank wiped down a table and caught sight of Brian helping his dad carry takeout boxes to a neighbor's car. Frank smiled faintly. Honor, he thought, doesn't live in medals or parades. It lives in the small moments, in how we carry our past and how we choose to lift others up. As Frank Matthews wiped down the last table of the night, the cafe slowly emptied, leaving behind only the faint scent of coffee and the soft hum of the dishwasher in the back. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the town he had quietly served for years. Frank's story reminds us of something we too often forget in modern life: the people we pass by every day, the cashier, the bus driver, the quiet neighbor down the street, may carry stories of sacrifice, struggle, and strength we can't begin to imagine. In a world moving faster every year, where social media often rewards mockery over kindness, Frank's experience invites us to slow down, look closer, and remember that dignity lives in the quiet corners of our communities. What would happen if we all looked past scars and appearances, if we chose respect over ridicule? What kind of world would we create if we passed on those values to the next generation? Just as Brian learned from his father? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been surprised by someone's hidden story? Have you ever judged quickly, only to realize there was so much more beneath the surface? Share your stories in the comments below. We read every one. Thank you for spending time with us today and for honoring the quiet heroes among us. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future stories that celebrate the best of humanity. Together, let's build a community that values respect, kindness, and the power of second chances.